you're behaving rationally if you are making the choices that achieve your own goals and values most effectively given the options available to you, right? So it's not about your goals and values have to be maximizing dollars or your goals and values have to be any particular thing. The idea is your goals and values come from inside you, and you should be asking yourself, essentially, are the choices I'm making doing the best job of achieving those values?
Welcome to the Secrets to Abundant Living podcast. Your guide on this journey is Amy Sylvis, ready to unlock the keys to a life of true abundance. We're diving into everything from financial freedom and optimal health to meaningful relationships, geographic freedom, and everything in between. It's about creating a life rich in experiences, purpose, and joy. Get ready for empowering conversations, expert insights, and real-life stories that inspire you to live abundantly. If you're ready for the secrets to an abundant life, hit that subscribe button now, and let's get started.
Secrets to Abundant Living podcast community. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our latest episode. And gosh, this is a really fun story. I've been looking forward to recording this episode for several weeks here. But for those who don't know who I am, I'm Amy Sylvis. I am the founder and CEO of Sylvis Capital. We connect investors to hands-off real estate investment opportunities. But this podcast is all about abundance. And I have a really fun story to share with you all with Dr. Harris. But I'm going to allow him to introduce himself really quickly. And then we're going to jump in because you guys are going to really love listening to him.
Hello, everyone. And Amy, thank you for having me on. This is a lot of fun. I'm Jorgen Harris. I'm a professor of economics at Occidental College. I do research on labor economics, particularly discrimination and gender and race inequality. And I teach a variety of classes in economics at Oxy.
So impressive. And the way that we met is even more special. And I think really speaks to who Dr. Harris is. I was out flying a kite with my father on a hill in Eagle Rock, which is adjacent to where I live, and bumped into Dr. Harris and his mom. We got to talking, and his story is just so impressive, talking about how he got into economics and how he thinks about helping the next generation and really everything in between, that I felt compelled to invite him to the podcast because the things that he mentioned on several levels really resonated with the abundance mindset that I know I share and our listeners share. Thank you for just meeting a random stranger, Doctor, and being willing to appear on the podcast. That's really special.
Yeah, likewise. It was definitely a really fun way to meet new people. And I think the credit really has to go to your dad, who's a total ham and just was not going to let us get off that hill before we had flown his kite and experienced the joy of watching it soar. What was it, 2 miles into the air, something like that? It was just an unbelievably high kite, and tell our life stories to each other. So it was great to meet you. It's a lot of fun to get to know your neighbor, and your podcast sounds awesome. So it's a lot of fun to be on this.
Thank you. Yeah, shout out to Greg Sylvis. When Greg does something, he does it big. And yes, kite flying was complete with a drill attachment to bring the kite back. There's just, yeah. Maybe we'll include a few pictures attached to this episode so folks can know. But yeah, he definitely wanted to make sure you all understood what he was up to, enjoyed it, hopefully as much as he did.
Absolutely.
Great. All right, Doctor, we were talking about how you began your career at Occidental College. And for those who don't know, a very wonderful, prestigious university here on the east side of Los Angeles in the San Gabriel Valley. You started in 2020, which must have been a wild time as a teacher, not just for you, for your students, for academia as a whole. Can you give us a little bit more about what that was like and your background there?
Yeah. So it was fall 2019 that I started. So my first year was the year that COVID hit off. And it was a very interesting time to be starting as a college professor. I was going into my second semester teaching 2 new classes and thought, oh, I just got to get through to spring break and then I can get caught up and I'll be okay. And of course, we left for spring break and we never came back. A lot of it was figuring out how to adapt on the fly to how am I going to teach online in a way that's effective. But I think it also did a lot to change the way that I understand my job, because part of my job, the core of my job is teaching students about economics, right? Teaching them the content of my classes. But what they needed at that time was to talk about this sort of dramatic upheaval in their lives and what they were going to do about it. And so I think the way that I thought about trying to create community with my students and trying to help them feel connected to me and to each other, I think I was forced to be a lot more thoughtful and intentional about that, because my first year as a professor was this year of massive upheaval than I would have been if I had started teaching a couple years earlier. So it was terrible, right? Of course, none of us enjoyed COVID. I think I did get a lot of positive things out of it because of the way that, in some ways, it made it much, much harder to connect with students, but it also meant they were so desperate for community that we were able to do things like, I started doing every Friday sort of a fun Zoom. We would set up a Zoom meeting at 12:30 around lunchtime. And the idea was, okay, I have my office hours, but this is going to be a time that you come in. We're not going to talk about, we can talk about the class, but we're not going to talk about the problem sets or stuff like this. We're going to get together and just talk to each other as humans, have my dog on camera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, no one's going to do this because it's just the cringiest thing in the world to sit there and be on a Zoom meeting with your professor talking about nothing. And there were probably, I don't know, maybe 8 people on average every week. And we ended up building this really nice community that continued once we were all back in person. The students kept wanting to do it, so I've kept doing it, and I've maintained this tradition all the way to now. Yeah, it really helped me figure out how to be a resource for my students more than just teaching them sort of the intellectual content of economics.
That's beautiful, because these are whole people, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really, you can't just compartmentalize and shove econ down their throat. I would imagine, as you said, in a time where they're confused, they're probably very frustrated, maybe they're really lacking connection. Not only are you someone that's, hey, this is the course, this is what we're doing, but now you're a human being, you're a friend, or maybe just someone that they can connect to. And I would imagine that opens their brain up much more to being receptive to what you're teaching, because it's not just you, the professor. You're tending to the whole person.
Right. And it also gives you a chance to, and this is something I've looked for ways to do this more actually in the classroom as well, but there's so much going on. COVID was this one moment of crisis, but there's been tumult and crisis continuously since then. And the goal, the reason I care about teaching them the economic theory isn't just that I want them to be good at using calculus to solve problems. It's that I want them to be able to think about, how do we use these tools to have a deeper understanding of your own life, have a deeper understanding of how you operate in the world we live in, understand what's happening in the world. And so being able to talk in an open-ended way about whatever they're interested in has really helped with that. Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's brilliant. I'm going to hop around a lot. There's a lot going in my brain, just to give everyone a little bit of background, because this is just so exciting. We resonate. I love econ. I don't know if my listeners know, I interned at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, Switzerland in undergrad. When all my friends were going off to booze cruises on spring break, I went on a European Union tour with George Mason University graduate students 2 months after the Euro launched to visit the European Central Bank and the European Commission, and where the Maastricht Treaty was signed. We might geek out here a little bit because I just think this is so special. But when we were talking, Doctor, you mentioned how applicable this economics can be, right? Because maybe some have this view that it's just this on the shelf or maybe abstract theory. But I really love that you bring up this real world application, maybe not even just on a macro level. And like you said, interpreting all of the craziness that's gone on in the past 5 years, but you really, in our conversation, distilled it down to how people are thinking about their own personal economics too, and what this next generation is thinking through. Would you mind elaborating a bit on it? Because I found that so fascinating.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. I guess there's a couple elements to this. So one thing is, something I've noticed talking to a lot of my students is, I don't know how much this is unique to this generation. I think this was true for people closer to our age as well, but it's probably more true for this generation, is that a lot of my students are grappling with wanting to do things with their lives that matter and that help solve problems, and also being concerned about their own financial stability, being able to provide for their parents, for future children, right, et cetera, and are trying to figure out how to balance all of these different priorities around what they're going to do with their lives and how they're going to use their lives in a way that they're going to be proud of and feel good about. And I think for the question of how can economics be useful for this, I think to me, there's a couple insights that I've pulled out of studying economics that I've tried to share with students. One thing is, I think a lot of people come into an econ classroom thinking that basically econ is the study of money, right? And that therefore the sort of the full source of value and the whole way that we should think about value is denominated in dollars, right? And when we talk about, especially the sort of deep microeconomic theory, the real idea here is that when we talk about economic rationality, the idea is that you're behaving rationally if you are making the choices that achieve your own goals and values most effectively given the options available to you.
Right.
Right. So it's not about your goals and values have to be maximizing dollars or your goals and values have to be any particular thing. The idea is your goals and values come from inside you. Right. And you should be asking yourself, essentially, are the choices I'm making doing the best job of achieving those values? And we also think a lot about margins and trade-offs, right? So it's not this sort of absolute. I either have to only do one thing or only do another thing, right? The idea is to ask myself, essentially, with the last 15 minutes of my day, right, should I be spending 15 minutes more working or 15 minutes more with my kid, right? Or 15 minutes more trying to increase my income or 15 minutes more trying to achieve good in the world around me, right? And so that sort of marginal thinking, I think, can also be really helpful. I think one of the things that, has come out of conversations with students about how to spend their lives in a productive way is this idea that maybe that it can be helpful not to let yourself fall completely into binary thinking, right? So if you're thinking about, am I going to be focused on myself, my own well-being? Am I going to be focused on solving problems in the world? You can be focused on both, right? And you can think about how to do things that are going to achieve both goals at once. And that can look very different for different kinds of people, right? And one of the things that I try to tell my students too is a lot of the question of what should you specifically, you personally do with your time, some of that is going to come to what do you want to accomplish with your time? Some of it is also going to come to what are the things that over the course of a day light you up, right? Make you feel the most engaged, make you feel the most connected to people around you, make you most excited to be working. Because part of this is also, and this is, I remember not feeling this way when I was 20 years old, right? And much more I feel this way now is understanding just how long our lives are, right? And as a consequence, how much you can do with an entire life if you maintain your ability to keep showing up for an entire life, right? And as a consequence of that, how important it is when you're thinking about what do I do if I want to do good in the world, how important it is to be structuring your life in a way that's sustainable for you, right? And that is filling your cup, making you feel a sense of abundance, making you feel good about your life, as opposed to purely feeling like I need to make sacrifices. Not that there's anything wrong with making sacrifices, but if you're making sacrifices that you're not going to maintain, right, over the course of 10, 20, 30, 40 years, then potentially you're going to miss out on the ability to do the sorts of things you can do, right, if you have sustained attention over decades. So that's sort of one of the big things that I've talked to my students about a lot, is that question of how do you find this balance and how do you make these trade-offs in a small way? And depending on who it is, right, this can mean things like, maybe you're the sort of person who the idea of working at a consulting company and pulling long, long weeks, doing lots of travel, being in a very competitive industry, trying to win contests, maybe that really fires you up. Maybe that's really exciting to you. And then you can go do that, make just a ton of money, right? And donate some of that money to things that you care about, right? And that's a way for you to do good in the world and also provide for yourself and also be really excited. Maybe you're a person who the idea of living that lifestyle is absolutely not what you want to do, right? And then you might want to think about, how do I find a work environment that's more collaborative, less competitive, right? That has better work-life balance, et cetera, and maybe working directly on things that matter to you. Being a professor, of course, we get to make those sorts of choices every day, because if I want to, I can pull 80, 100-hour weeks and I'm never going to run out of things to do, right? Because I'm working on my own projects, my own classes, et cetera. I also have a lot of freedom to say, this week, I'm not going to do that. Right? This week, the number of hours that I actually have to be in a specific place in a specific time or I'll get in trouble is, even when I'm teaching, less than 20 hours a week. Yeah. So a lot of it is this question of what do you want your specific life to look like? What's going to fire you up personally? And also, what do you want to accomplish over the course of many decades? One last thing I'd say that I think is really important is, I think particularly now, because I think the world that a current 20-year-old has been living in is in a lot of ways more chaotic and more negative than the world that I lived in when I was 20. I think that has led a lot of people to have a sense of fatalism, that problems aren't going to be solved and there's essentially not ways to do meaningful things with your life. And I think this is another thing that I've really tried to push back on, is this sense of fatalism. There's a lot of things we can do that directly help solve very real problems, and there's real problems getting solved all the time. So one of the things that I think about a lot is global public health in terms of problems that have been dramatically solved. If you look at how many people in the world live in extreme poverty, the numbers have fallen so dramatically over the last 40 years. Infant mortality rates have fallen so much around the world in the last 40 years. And any of us can donate money, right, to buy bed nets, to buy vitamin A supplementation, to clean well water in developing countries. And those donations can save lives for relatively small amounts of money, right? For a few $1,000s, you can save somebody's life. So that's not necessarily for every single person. That's not necessarily the way that you're going to go try to make a positive impact, is by buying bed nets and vitamin A supplementation. But it's an option that's available to every single one of us that has real impact, right? And this is true across a wide range of different areas. There's people all over the world who are doing things in a concerted way that are genuinely making things better in a way that often doesn't show up on a day-to-day headline because it's a process that unfolds over decades. And I think helping people keep that in mind can help protect us from this sense of despair, right? And help us remember that even us not necessarily becoming big people in the world, right? Being small people in the world can matter a lot.
Have you ever thought about having multiple streams of income? Instead of relying on just one stream of income where you're trading your time for money, how would you like to free up more of your time and live a more abundant life? As a listener of the show, you're invited to attend one of our upcoming trainings where I'll give you an inside look into how you can add passive income and get all the other perks of recession-resistant real estate investing without the headaches of being a landlord. I'll also be sharing some hidden mistakes to avoid and the criteria I personally look for when evaluating potential investment opportunities. To reserve your seat for free, go to sylviscapital.com/webinar. Again, that special link to reserve your seat for free is sylviscapital.com/webinar. I look forward to seeing you on the training. And now back to the show. Brilliant. Oh, there's so many gems there. Gosh, so many gems. I'm just reflecting, I'm sure our audience is too. I hope everyone was fortunate enough to have a Dr. Harris when they were growing up in some part of their education. No, truly, I'm thinking about one professor I had in elementary school that I actually still talk to all these days later that kind of had this same sense that you do of, this isn't just, we're shaping minds here. And going back to where you started about helping folks understand that there isn't just one way to live a life. This can be an exploratory thing that you figure out what works for you, and it might not work for other people. I don't know about you, but my experience in the education system, and I happen to be lucky that I had the type of brain that fit the education system, but I think about those who don't fit into that box and how it must make them feel and the kind of lives that they're maybe taught that they might be able to have, and you being able to expand that narrative and really help people understand that there is no one right way. And in fact, you can even pivot. You go one way, like you said, it's a long life, God willing, for most people.
Absolutely.
You pivot one way, you can go another. And then not having this binary kind of thought process of, oh, I either think about number one and maximize all the money and maybe kill my health and my relationships on the way, or I do good. Is there a middle path where you can strike both of those, or maybe you bob and weave? It resonates so much, I'm sure, with our listeners too. What we talk about here on the podcast is just, this can be your individual journey. And my gosh, having someone like you and community around that are fostering that gives us ideas, gives us support, and allows us to be who we are instead of trying to mold ourselves into maybe what society or even social media is telling young people to do. It's so empowering.
That's an incredibly kind thing to say. And of course, my ego is just exploding right now. So thank you so much. And I want to say on these lines, I'm really appreciative. As you're saying, I had professors in college who really saw me as a human being and cared about me, and that really changed my life. There was one professor in particular in college, George Tolley, who sadly passed away a few years ago, who was just an incredible mentor to me. And also faculty here. One of the things I've really liked about working at a small liberal arts college is that I've really been able to learn from role models here of other faculty who have thought a lot about how to connect with students in a deep level and how to be a real resource. And so I'm really grateful that I've been able to be shaped by that. I really agree with you that, as you say, I'm a person who was well served by the way our education system works. I liked school all the way through school. I'm still at school because I like it so much.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think that there's a couple aspects of the way education works for pretty much everyone that teach us lessons that aren't necessarily applicable for the rest of the world. One thing is that our education system is structured as a continuous contest, right? Because we're graded on everything we do when we're in school. And as a consequence of that, I think it can feed this sort of mindset where we think that there's this sort of hierarchy, right? There's the better people and the worse people, right? There's the A students and there's the C students, and that tells you how you stack up. And also that success means that there's some other person who holds the standard, and your job is to figure out how to meet their standard, right? How to crack the code of this particular professor. What are they looking for, right? What's the essay they want me to write? What do they think the right answer is on this test, et cetera, right? And out in the world, neither of those things are really, so I guess that's the first thing. And the second thing is you're saying there's this one linear path. And that becomes a little less true in college because you can choose your majors. But by and large, there's this sort of progression where you go from one grade to the next grade. You're supposed to go from high school to college. You're supposed to try to get into a good college and then get good grades in college and graduate, do well in your major, et cetera, where the set of choices that you're making are not that large. Largely what you're doing is moving up a conveyor belt, right? And I think those two sets of things, right? This idea of the goal is to win this set of competitions, right? According to this sort of external authority on what's good and what's bad. And also the goal is to work your way up the conveyor belt. Both of those I think are less true in adult life than they are in school, right? You graduate from college and then instead of there being a next obvious step on the conveyor belt, there's 1,000 choices.
Yes.
And a lot of those are choices that you might have absolutely never heard of, right? So that part of the goal, of course, is to get a good job, right? To win the interview, et cetera. But another huge part of your goal should be just exploring, right? Learning what the options are and trying to find an option that fits you well. We talked about this a little bit on Fiji Hill, flying our kites, right? But for most of us, definitely for me, when I thought about what jobs exist going out of college, I knew what my parents did. I knew what some of my relatives did. I knew about being a teacher, right? Because I'd been around teachers all the time.
Yeah.
But throughout my life, I keep meeting people with different jobs and different ways of building their lives that I'd never considered, right? Never heard of. And I think that's true for all of us. So instead of what's the next step on the conveyor belt, what's the next conveyor belt I should hop on once I get out of college, there's a huge benefit to instead thinking, well, I have this massive, incredibly diverse array of options, including options I might build completely myself.
Yes.
Right. And so rather than what's the next contest to win, it's a question of in this huge space to explore, what's the right thing for me? And I think similarly, when it comes to this idea of ranking people against each other, obviously there's still some of that in adult life, right? There's still contests to win. You can do better or worse and get a good performance review, et cetera. But I've had a lot of students who were consistent C students in college and then find their thing, which maybe doesn't look very similar to sitting in class and figuring out how to ace a test, and do amazingly at their thing. And so because of the fact that we live in this highly diversified economy with this huge number of different roles to go into, it's less about how do I rank next to someone next to me versus am I finding the right fit for myself? And am I growing in the ways that I want to grow, right? We end up there's a huge return to thinking about how am I growing? How do I compare to me? How do I compare to the me I want to be? Rather than how do I compare to these other people, right? Who have different attributes than me, different skills than me, and different goals than me.
Right. Yeah. And thank goodness we're not all the same. How
Exactly.
miserable, right? How miserable
Absolutely.
socially,
Right.
how miserable
Completely.
the economy would be.
Completely.
Yeah. Celebrating those differences and leaning into them. It sounds a little corny, but it just could not be more
Completely.
true. That is the beauty of it all. Being able to facilitate even within kind of the academic experience of you helping your students understand this reality when they're that age, against that fatalism. That's really encouraging to hear. I would love to hear, just to end this, I was talking to a friend, and I'd love your opinion. I'm going to drop a slight curveball on you. I think there are definitely people in society economically that feel like they have theirs. They're set on their trajectory, good where they are, and they are just, okay, I'm not going to really pay attention to anything else. But I'd love to explore this concept with you, if you're comfortable, about we all need to make sure everyone's okay, even if it's our own self-interest. If we've got a whole segment of society, even younger folks, that feel like this system is not for me, I'm going to opt out no matter how hard I try. I'm not going to be able to get my basic needs met. I'm just going to give up. I think that impacts all of us, even if it doesn't pull on your moral compass, even if you think you're insulated. I don't think that you are. Given kind of some of the economic work that you do and maybe what you study and teach, would you mind commenting on that? Just I'm curious about your perspective, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really appreciate this question. I think it's critically important. And I guess I would look at it a couple different ways, and I'll try not to be so long-winded, right?
No, you're
Which is,
great.
of course, always the challenge.
It's a podcast.
Yeah,
Well,
right, exactly,
yeah.
exactly. I think there's a couple pieces to this. One is this idea that we've been talking about of so much of leading a good life is about being able to explore what makes you happy, what you're good at, right? What lights you up inside. I think that we are, as a society, as an economy, we are much better at giving some people the ability to do that than others, right? And to look for those talents in some people than others.
Yes.
A lot of the jobs that exist in our economy are very much jobs that basically treat people as flesh and blood robots at some level, right? In some ways, because the job has to be done a certain way, right? If you're in an Amazon warehouse, you have to put the items in the right box, right? If you put it in the wrong box, there's no individuality there. But also, I think in a lot of ways, because of cultural assumptions about which people have things to contribute. If we think about, and a consequence of that, I think a consequence of the sort of a culture that doesn't necessarily look for capability in everyone is that we all miss out on a lot of great ideas and a lot of wealth. There's this really wonderful paper, and I'm going to get the details of this wrong because I'm not looking at it, right? But some macroeconomists, one of them out of University of Chicago named Jorgen Harris, asked this question, essentially, how much of the economic growth that we experienced in the second half of the 20th century comes from not restricting the top jobs in our society to white men. If you look at the economy of 1950, 1960, virtually every doctor, every lawyer, right, every professional in the country was a white male. We look at those same professions now, and representation of women has increased dramatically. Representation of minorities has increased dramatically. And if you think that essentially we have a distribution of talent that doesn't particularly depend on people's race and gender, right, what that means is we were ignoring the majority of our talent pool in 1960. So they do some analysis where they essentially ask the question of, right, how much of the increase in productivity over this time period is a consequence of broader based human capital? And I want to say that they estimate a majority of growth over that time period comes from the fact that we, still not to a full degree, right, but to a greater degree, we're creating room in our society for more people. So I think there's also some work, particularly looking at developing countries, where we tend to, as economists, be much more comfortable assuming that developing countries are missing opportunities for growth, right? In developing countries, there's work by an economist, Jorgen Harris, essentially arguing that the question of what percentage of the society is in a position to make contributions, real contributions, is one of the biggest drivers for growth. So he describes this as a difference between inclusive institutions and extractive institutions, right? And the idea is in a lot of societies, especially post-colonial societies, you essentially have a ruling elite that are the only people who really have access to, right, positions as leaders. And as a consequence of this, right, 95% of people can't contribute no matter how talented they are. When you expand the set of people who can contribute, you get much better ideas, right? There's people who can do things that we wouldn't know they could do if we weren't looking. So I think that's one side of this, right? Is essentially that being in a position where we're looking for talent everywhere just means we get more talent, right? And more other people expressing their talents around us doesn't mean we're locked out of good opportunities. It means that there's more opportunities for everyone. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, as you're alluding to, a society where everyone feels like they have a reasonable chance, and a society where everyone feels like they have a stake in the system, is going to be a society that's more cooperative and less destructive than a society where a lot of people feel that they don't have a reasonable chance. There's this wonderful, just this little tiny toy example of this by an economist I love named Kaushik Basu, which is asking, if we think about individual self-interest, and this is less true now in the Uber era, right? But in the pre-Uber era, if you think about taking a taxi to the airport, most people pay in cash, right? And so there's a question, okay, you sit in the taxi, you tell the taxi driver to take you to the airport, you get to the airport, why on earth would you give them cash? You're already at the airport, right? What's the cost? And your answer might be, well, the taxi driver will get really mad at me if I don't give them cash. Maybe they'll beat me up or they'll go get a police officer or something. But that leads to the question, Okay, why doesn't the taxi driver just do that after I give them cash to get cash twice? Right? Same situation, right? No one but me and them know that I handed over cash. And at the end of the day, the only reason the system works, right, where you take the taxi and you pay the person afterwards and no one can verify whether you paid them, is because we live in a society of shared morals and shared trust, right? Is that you assume that the taxi driver is much more likely to berate you or get a police officer or have some big reaction if you don't pay them than if you do, right? They're not going to try to scam you. And the taxi driver assumes that you're going to pay them, right? A lot of things in our society work like this, right? That when we all are at an atmosphere of mutual trust, we don't need to take these massive, expensive precautions to protect ourselves from each other, right? We don't need to live in gated communities. We don't need to have guns. We don't need to put bars on our windows, right? We can leave our bicycle on our front lawn, right? Because we trust our neighbors not to steal our bicycle. In big ways and small ways, living in a society where everyone is bought into the social contract just is very different from living in a society where people aren't. And you can't really expect someone to buy into the social contract if they think the contract protects me and not you. Right? This is the other side of this, is I think we just, in addition to wanting to get the most out of people, we also want to be on each other's team, right? We want to be, all of us benefit from being in a situation where we feel like we're in this together, right? We're helping each other when we can trust each other. And I think those of us, like myself, right, who are really on getting a pretty good deal out of our society, I can't expect other people to treat me like they're on my team, right? If I'm not trying to make room to make sure that they're also getting a good deal out of our society.
So well said. Wow. 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 Thank you so much for indulging me in that,
Oh my
that
gosh.
question. That was an even better
Absolutely.
answer than I imagined. Yeah. Wow. Lots to think about. Dr. Harris, I could talk to you for hours and hours on end, but I know we run out of time. Maybe we'll fly a
Yeah, we
kite
should get a
together
coffee,
again
you know,
soon.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, or coffee. We live, that's the fun
Yeah,
thing.
we live very close to each other.
Yeah, you're just down the street over there, which is really, really fun.
Exactly.
But thank you so much for your wisdom, for your just willingness to share a peek into the great things that you're doing with the next generation. Just so impressive. I'm sure there are going to be listeners that will want to reach out to you. Where can they get in touch with you?
Oh, so you can send me an email at jorgenharris@oxy.edu.
Okay.
And yeah, that's probably the best way to get in touch.
Perfect. We'll put that in the show notes so that
Beautiful.
everyone, if you're driving and listening, you can just go back and reference. Thank you again. Really, really appreciate you being on the podcast today. This is really special.
Well, could I throw out right before we end just a tiny piece of advice to any listeners who are considering where to go to college or finishing up high school, is that if you're thinking about where to go to college, in addition to looking at the rankings, send an email to a couple professors of the places you're considering and see what kind of response you get. I think that's the best way for you to know, are you going to go to college somewhere where people are going to look out for you as a person?
Brilliant tip. Wow.
Beautiful.
Okay. Thank you for doing that.
Absolutely.
Thanks again. We really appreciate having
Absolutely.
you on, Dr. Harris. Everyone.
Likewise, it's been a lot of fun.
Yes. We'll talk to y'all soon, everyone. Thanks again. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of the Secrets to Abundant Living podcast. We hope you found inspiration and valuable insights that will empower you on your journey towards abundance. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback means the world to us, and it helps others discover the secrets to an abundant life too. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn, Amy Sylvis. Keep striving for your goals, nurturing your relationships, and embracing the adventure that is life. Until next time, we wish you an abundantly fulfilling day.